saw at the other corner these men with long black beards. I went over to them and I asked them what they were preaching. And they told me I probably wouldn't be interested in it. I said, why not? And they said, well, because you're the devil. Let me get this right. You believe that there's only one God and that Muhammad is his messenger. I said, yeah, when you put it that way, I do. And they said, you're a Muslim. And I laughed. I said, I'm a Muslim? You're a Muslim. You're from Pakistan. I'm just a guy who believes in God. I am a professor of comparative religion, and I teach classes in Islam also at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Actually, by heritage, my background is Jewish, but I grew up in a very secular household. And there wasn't a lot of religious practice. The only connection I really had to any kind of traditional religion was from my father's side, my grandmother, my father's mother, who was a practicing Jew. You know, it's from her that I learned a few things, Bible stories, stories of the prophets. For a brief period, my parents actually attempted to send me to a Hebrew school to learn more, but I was not very comfortable there and actually got kicked out for asking too many questions. So this is probably my character, and it has brought me, I should say, to where I am today. My best friend at that time was from Pakistan. I went to an international school, so I had friends from all over the world. I had a Pakistani friend who gave me a copy of the Qur'an. You know, he wanted me to read it. He said, I don't want you to go to hell. And of course, at that time in my life, thoughts of hell or heaven were not really in my consciousness. And I think I took the book and put it on my shelf, and there it stayed for many years without being opened. And it really wasn't until I entered university that I began to ask the questions that would lead me directly onto this path. I think as a child I was always thoughtful and always wondered about the meaning of life and, you know, those basic questions of why we're here and where we're going, why we suffer. All of those things were always present in my mind, even as a child. But as I got older and when I went to university, I focused a lot more on my studies until I had a particular experience. You remember the grandmother that I mentioned before? When I was in university, I was living in Washington, D.C., and I got a phone call from my cousin who was going to school in Maryland. It was a surprise visit from my grandparents and my aunt and another cousin, and they took me out for dinner. And I spent the evening basically just talking to my grandmother. I told her about my plans to start studying Chinese, which I was doing at the time. I told her about my plans to move back to New York, to transfer to Columbia University. And it was almost as if I saw her and she was giving me her blessing on all of these various decisions that I was making in my life as a young adult. At the end of the evening, I was walking her to her car, and in the parking lot of this restaurant, she turned her ankle and she tripped. And I asked her, Grandma, are you okay? And she said, don't worry about me, just worry about yourself. Okay, I thought. And then I continued to walk with her to the car. I opened the door, she got in, I kissed her goodnight, and I said, well, I guess the next time I'll see you will be for Thanksgiving when I come back to New York. And she said to me, God willing. Okay, I didn't think much of it at the time. I closed the door and off they drove. My cousin took me back to my dormitory. I went to bed, and early the next morning, I got a phone call, and it was my cousin. And I asked him why he was calling so early, and he said, there was no other way to say it. He said, Grandma died. I said, really? I said, what are you talking about? And he explained that she had a heart attack in her sleep. And of course, her final words to me, were echoing in my ears. I said, I'll see you soon. And she said, God willing. I went back to New York for the funeral, and it was a traditional Jewish funeral. And the rabbi who was giving the eulogy spoke about my grandmother and said, Sarah was a rare treasure, he said. She was like a jewel, and now God has taken this treasure back to him. I said, okay. That's what rabbis would say. When the rabbi came to my grandfather's house to pay his respects, I wanted to ask him some questions. I wanted to ask him questions about certain practices that are practiced in a Jewish home at the time of someone's death. And he told me, don't worry about those things. He said, that's just tradition. I said, okay. Then how about this? In your sermon, you said that my grandmother, I don't know how well you knew her, but you said that she was taken by God. So where is she? And for that matter, where will I go? Where will you go? Where do I know this go? And why are we here? And all of those questions that well up in the human heart. And the rabbi, I remember very clearly, he looked at his watch and he said, I have to go. And I don't think that he realized how angry that made me. I also don't think that he realized at that time that he set me on a course that would lead me to where I am today. Because I became very interested in those questions. And at first I thought I would try to answer those questions, paying respect to my grandmother's memory. I would try to find a Jewish community where I could answer those questions. But the communities that I found, and again, I was just 18 or 19 years old at the time, the communities that I found were not satisfactory to me. And I asked the question which I had asked many times as a child, is God only the God of the Jews? There are only 20 million Jews in the world, and yet there are billions and billions of other people. God created them also, right? So I began to study on my own. I began to read the Bible. And that summer, when I was in England, I was there for an internship. There were some Christians, some evangelical Christians who approached me and wanted to socialize. Of course, they also wanted me to accept their faith. I thought, okay, why not try Christianity? I've never really thought about it. And in reading the Bible, I came to develop a very strong feeling of love and respect for Jesus. But that extra leap that they wanted me to make to accept Jesus as my Lord and my Savior was not one that I could do. Jesus for me was more like a big brother. Jesus for me was more like a teacher. Jesus for me was a Jew. I couldn't accept the claims that they were making about him. I thought, okay, I'm not going to find any answers to my questions. On my own, I studied other things. I studied Eastern philosophies, Buddhism, but nothing really was answering the profound questions that I had. Then one day, I was back in New York, just before I began my semester at my new school, and I was at Times Square, and there were all sorts of religious preachers. I remember speaking to one guy. I always love to talk to people about religion, often as a skeptic. And there was one guy who was a Jew for Jesus, and he was telling me what he believed, and I had heard it before. To me, it was basically Christianity. And he asked me if I would pray with him, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't believe what you believe. He said, do you believe in God? I said, I think I do. And he said, then pray with me. We'll just pray to God. He put his hand on my shoulder, closed his eyes, and started speaking to the Father. And with his eyes closed, I started to look around at where I was, and I saw at the other corner these men with long black beards, white robes, jalabiya, white turbans. They were African or African American, but they looked like they had walked right off the pages of the Bible. They looked like Noah or Abraham or something like that. So I thought, well, I know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but why not? Why not talk to them? And I went over after the Jew for Jesus finished praying. I went over to them and I asked them what they were preaching. And they told me I probably wouldn't be interested in it. I said, why not? And they said, well, because you're the devil. I said, really? I'm the devil. And they said, well, all white men are devils. And I said, if I'm the devil, let me just ask you this one question. If I am the devil, why am I so thirsty to know God? And they explained to me that even the devil believes in God. And I asked them, I said, where did you get this knowledge? I actually knew, I had written a paper in college about Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. And so I understood that they were probably some derivative of that black nationalist movement. But I asked them what their source was for this claim of my satanic nature. And they gave me some verses from the Bible, Book of Daniel, I think. And I said, no. If I want the Bible, I can go down the street to the Jew for Jesus or to some other Christian. What about your book? Don't you read the Qur'an? And they said, yes. And so they gave me some verse to read from Surat Al-Kahf. And I took it home. I took home the paper that I wrote it on, and immediately I went up to my bookshelf where I had the Qur'an that was given to me about 6 years earlier by my friend Mansour. And I started reading. I looked for the passage that they had directed me to. And of course I read it, and there was no indication there that I was the devil or that any other white person was the devil. But since I started reading, I went to the beginning of the book, and I just began to read. And I read, and I read, and I read until I fell asleep with the book in my hands. The next day, I read, and I read, and I read when I had some free time. And any time I had free time, between classes, when I was commuting to school on the New York City subway, I was just reading the Qur'an. It moved me in a way that other books hadn't. Certainly in a way that the Bible didn't. The Qur'an's directness and the fact that the Lord of the worlds, right, the Creator, as the book describes the author, is speaking directly to you at times. Very direct way, very intimately. It moved me in a way that I had not felt before. I can't tell you where or when exactly. I know that there were times that I would read it, and sometimes I could feel tears in my eyes and running down my face. Sometimes I would read it and the hair on my arm would stand up, or on the back of my neck. And I can't pinpoint precisely the time or the place, but at some point I think that I had realized that I was reading the words of God. I was out with some friends from high school. We were having coffee, and we were just talking about what was going on in our lives. They asked me, what do you believe these days? And they knew me as someone who didn't really believe in anything. So they asked me, and I said, well, I believe in God. And they said, really? What God? I said, there's only one God. And they said, where did you get this from? I said, well, for me, it was from reading the Qur'an. And they said, so you've been reading the Qur'an, so you must believe that this is the message of God and Muhammad is the messenger of God. I said, yeah, I guess so. So they said, okay, let me get this right. You believe that there's only one God and that Muhammad is his messenger. I said, yeah, when you put it that way, I do. And they said, you're a Muslim. And I laughed. I said, I'm a Muslim? You're a Muslim. You're from Pakistan. I'm just a guy who believes in God. They said, no, you're a Muslim. If you believe that there is no God but the one God and that Muhammad is his messenger, you are a Muslim. And I was in shock. For the next few days, had to think about what that meant. I contacted my friend Mansour, the one who had given me the Qur'an when I was 13 years old. He was at University of Pennsylvania, and so I asked him if he could send me some literature that might, give an introduction to Islam, and also, the life and the requirements, I guess, of a Muslim. And he sent me a book or two, and one book in particular, Islam in Focus. This book provided a very good introduction, not only to basic beliefs, but also to the 5 pillars of Islam. And I learned how to make salat. I learned how to pronounce the Shahada. I learned how to make my wudu, all of these things from that book. I started praying. I guess you could say I was a closet Muslim because I was living in my parents' home at that time, and I would close the door and I would say my prayers. And even the first time that I ever fasted in the month of Ramadan, I did it completely on my own. I had no community. I just found out what time the sun would rise and what time the sun would set, and ate at the times that were permitted. And so for the first 6 or 8 months of my life as a new Muslim, I did this completely alone. And my guide was the Qur'an and the book of this scholar. And that's the story of how I embraced Islam, actually.